Hello, welcome to AT&T ThreatTraq for July 26, 2016. This program provides network security highlights, discussion, and countermeasures for cyber threats. Today we're joined remotely by Patrick McKenna. Welcome back, Patrick. It's been some time since we've seen you here, and I'm guessing the weather in Seattle is much better than it is here, or at least cooler than it is in New Jersey.
I'm going to let you in on a little secret, Brian. I am taking a week off, and I am actually in the Cascade Mountains in a town called Bering, Washington. It's about 20 minutes from Stevens Pass. So I can tell you the entire western part of Washington right now is probably the best part of the country.
Yeah, there you go. So I was guessing correctly. Well, welcome back. Glad to have you here. And we have Matt Kaiser here. Welcome, Matt. It's good to see you again. And John Hogeboom.
Back again.
Back again. I'm Brian Rexroad, and Patrick, let's go to you first. And, I guess Defcon is coming up pretty soon. We're hoping to provide a little bit of coverage on this, but there's an activity for just about everybody here. Tell us more.
Yeah, so we've got Hacker Christmas coming up, of course. Black Hat and Defcon start next week. And AT&T is once again returning to sponsor an event that's incredibly special. It's called Roots Asylum. And what Roots Asylum is a nonprofit dedicated to teaching kids around the world about how to love being white hat hackers. It happens during Defcon on August 5th through the 7th, and Defcon attendees are encouraged to bring their kids. It's typically kids between 8 and 16 who are really getting a lot of benefit from the event. And last year we had about 300 kids attending. This year we're expecting just as many. So if you are attending Defcon and you have children who are interested in learning about security, I would definitely encourage you to bring them. It is a kids event, so there are no random parents wandering around. You have to come in and walk your kids through the different labs and talks that are there. Mm-hmm. In addition to sponsoring the event, we do provide some learning labs. One of the labs that we've been running for several years now is something called the Junkyard. And as a bunch of engineering nerds, I'm sure we all look back fondly on our first experiences tearing open computers and breaking them and seeing what's inside them. So at the Junkyard, we bring lots of old equipment that kids can disassemble and see what's working on the inside. Some of the kids end up repurposing some of the hardware. So we've seen kids take servos from printers and make personal fans. We've seen kids develop personal iPhone speakers based on PC speakers that were removed from old computers. So there's just lots of cool things that the kids can disassemble. And then we have one other cool thing, which is we do a lab called Be a Security Professional for a Day. And so if you have kids that are really starting to think that they might want to learn about computers in a more advanced way and want to do some security work, we have a pen testing lab where the kids can they get a hire letter, and they're invited to do some research on a new vulnerability that they heard about, that the boss heard about, and they want them to see whether or not there's any servers in the network that are vulnerable to it. So the kids get to do some scanning, identify a web server, and determine whether or not it's vulnerable. They even get to fight with the developer who says, I never write insecure code, and so they get to prove that the vulnerability is active on the web server as well. And then we also do a little bit of security operations work. So the kids are going to be able to see what it looks like when a web server is accessed in real time and when it's compromised, and how we harden those machines so that the kids don't, that the servers don't get tipped over. So in addition to that, Facebook puts on a Capture the Flag event for the kids. We've had Mark Rogers, who's one of the security experts who consults for Mr. Robot, do talks at Roots Asylum. We've had Whit Diffie. I mean, there's just a lot of really cool people that have done things. Cory Doctorow as well. So it's a really, really great event for kids who are starting to think that they might be really interested in technology and in particular security defense.
All right, very cool. And what better way to spend the tail end of the summer just before school starts than to accompany a parent or a partner over to the over to this event and learn some things on the way. Get a little acclimated for school, right? Sure. Very cool.
Yeah. I'm sure every Roots Asylum attendee is probably getting 50% better grades, but that's just my personal opinion. I have no facts to back that up.
But they have something for their What I Did This Summer essay, too. Absolutely.
Right.
That'll be cool.
Very cool. And I guess as a final comment on this, the hacking is one thing, and I'm not going to say everybody can do hacking because it definitely takes some, obviously some skills, some talent, and motivation. But the white hat aspect of this, that is defending systems, and being in a position to do that is a higher order. So it's good that there's an opportunity for kids to get acquainted with this and perhaps make a career of it. So thanks for bringing that.
That's exactly right. And that, just to put a bow on it, the big reason why AT&T sponsors this is InfoSec mentorship is important. It feels like every month we're reading stories about kids who start exploring computers and end up getting in trouble at school or maybe in their town because they didn't have a guide. So Roots Asylum gets these kids access to a mentorship network that makes sure that they're doing things in the safe way and understand kind of what's responsible and what's over the line. So it's a great event.
All right, great. Thank you very much for that. And so I guess another good news topic here, Matt?
Sure. So there's just recently, I believe it's a collaboration between law enforcement and several AV companies. The site NoMoreRansom.org just opened up. And what it is, it's a site with information about ransomware, some tools to help you decrypt your files for certain ransomware families if you happen to be infected by one of them, and then also information about other families of malware and information on how to contact law enforcement if you are infected. And this is an interesting idea. Most people, I think, at this point have sort of got used to the idea that this is just something that happens on the internet. People get infected. It's not they don't think of it as someone did this deliberate to me. This is a crime that was perpetrated against me. I should take it to law enforcement. So by encouraging that, I think it's really kind of positive that you'll show that, yes, this is a problem. The police become aware of it and hopefully get some resources dedicated towards actually tackling it.
Yeah, it's very good. And I have to reflect on your point about I think we've become numb over the years and years of evolving malware. Think back, what was it, the Da Vinci virus on the floppy disk?
That was hackers.
But I mean, the notion of infecting computers, we've become numb to the fact that that's actually a crime. And it really needs to be reinforced, and this is a good opportunity for organizations to help reinforce that and encourage folks to report it. And even if each case, obviously each case isn't going to be investigated, but having good data in terms of trending about actual victims and the cost that it is incurring on those folks to be able to recover from it is an important part of building a good criminal case and to really get influence around making sure that those cases do get investigated.
Right.
Collectively.
Unless law enforcement can really quantify it well, I don't think that they're in a good position to really take, good action. So being able to have good quantification around how many incidents there are and assign monetary costs to that can really help them get more traction to mobilize around trying to solve this problem. So.
Yeah, absolutely. So thanks for bringing that, Matt. Okay, John, let's go to you, and pretty important patching activity going on with iOS this week.
Yeah, so this is not unlike the stage fright vulnerability for Android last year, where when you received a text message that had a multimedia file, you could do some remote code execution. But in this case, it's in the Apple iOS, and that covers not just the iPhone, but also the tablets, OS X. Their TV OS has been patched for this, and the Apple Watch OS, this is patched, just so you know. Nobody send me any text messages. However, basically the basic gist of this vulnerability is there is a vulnerability in Apple's Image I/O API, and if you send a TIFF file, I don't know if TIFF is the only format, but that's the one they mention in the write-up on this.
At least one.
If you send a specially crafted TIFF file, when the parser, the Image I/O API goes to read that and render it onto the screen, it could execute a buffer overflow, which could lead to remote execution, code execution. Now, what privilege level you'd be at that point, I'm not quite sure. If you're going to be kind of in a sandbox still, but be able to access maybe other things in the Messages app. Or what, I'm not quite sure. But it does cross more than just instant messaging. That's one of the examples that they used, but it can be in Safari, in your browser, in the mail client, and probably a bunch of other places, wherever you have to render an image. They do mention that the iMessage, as part of your SMS messaging or MMS messaging, is an interesting avenue because your phone will attempt to render that without you having an intervention.
Right, it'll put it right up on the notifications display if you have that enabled, and so that's a possibility. You don't have to do any action, and the next thing you know.
Right. So somebody could just blitz it out there. As far as I'm aware, I haven't seen that this is actually being exploited in the wild that I'm aware of. But there are patches available. It's 9.3.3 for your iPhone. So if you go check your iPhone, you should see that there's a patch available. The other interesting thing I thought, which I really haven't been tracking, if you have an iPhone 4, not the 4S, 4S and up is covered with OS 9.3.3, but 4 and older are not. So they kind of discontinued. I don't know if it's completely discontinued, but they're still on iOS 7 for the iPhone 4. So the patch is not available for those devices, which may be a reason to upgrade or find other means to do whatever you need to do. Anyway, just one of those things to make people aware of. The patch came out recently. I want to say it was either this week or last week.
I think it was on the 18th, perhaps.
18th?
So this is
Okay.
it's been about a week now.
Okay.
But the thing that I had noticed is oftentimes you'll get a notice that there's a patch to install or an upgrade to install. My experience has been I did not get a notice.
I didn't either on my
dig
phone
for it.
this time. I had to go in and actually look, and I see that it said that there's a patch available and apply it. But a lot of times it'll tell me when at some point, I don't know, randomly, maybe when you plug in something to charge it, it goes and checks, but it usually tells me that there's a new update.
All right. So go out and get that patch done before this becomes something that's actually in the wild, because I'd have to anticipate that somebody's at least taking a look at how they could take.
Well, certainly now that the patch is out, once the patch is distributed, a lot of these guys can take that and reverse engineer to see what was applied in this patch to figure out how could I exploit that.
Yeah, and there's just one little itch that I need to scratch. It is certainly reminiscent of the stage fright vulnerability in that it is an image handling related vuln. But stage fright, the things that were interesting about stage fright weren't necessarily about the vulnerability in the code itself, but all of the side effects of the diversity of the Android ecosystem. And so, iOS is leading the industry in demonstrating how to do mobile updates. Stage fright became complex because there were many orphan devices and software libraries that weren't necessarily available on some of the earlier devices. So capabilities like ASLR. iOS, just as long as people are practicing really good technology hygiene, applying your software updates, the story is very, very different. So image handling related, but I wouldn't get too wrapped around the axle about whether or not it's like stage fright. There's similarities, but it's functionally very different.
Okay, well, and actually that's a very good comparison and contrast. Thank you, Patrick. So with that, let's go to Matt. And Matt, you've been busy reading.
I have.
And I happen to be a fan of Bruce Schneier myself. I think he has a lot of very good thought about security topics. So tell us about his latest book.
Sure. So this is Data in Goliath. Subtitle is The Hidden Battles to Collect Your Data and Control Your World. It is not as radical as the title may make it sound. I actually thought one of the most impressive things about the book is how well researched it is. There's 241 pages of text in my copy and 123 pages of notes and citations. So when you start talking about surveillance and spying and collection of data, people sometimes look at you and think you might be a little bit like conspiracy theory, woo-woo, nutty, but having these citations in here to back up the things that he's talking about really helps. I found it really interesting. It starts off with the way things are today. You talk about government surveillance, you talk about corporate data mining and collection for advertising or other purposes, talks about the effects of surveillance, and then ends up with a discussion of what can we do about the problem. And not all of his suggestions were immediately apparent to me. I think the ones about limiting the information that a company collects are really good ideas, especially in light of the number of data breaches we've had. Had that data not been retained and stored improperly, or if you don't need it to be around, it's a liability in the fact that it exists in a single place. So, I mean, the book is full of ideas, and that was one of the most interesting ones for me. But going through and looking at the facts that, any device that has a processor in it has the ability to collect data. If it has storage, has the ability to store that data. And he used the phrase, data is the exhaust of the internet, which it kind of makes sense. As you go through a system and you interact with it, you create these logs. And on the one hand, as a security analyst, these logs are exactly the kinds of things that we use on a day-to-day basis to find out who's been infected, who's attacking our networks, and they have a purpose. But at the same time, I started thinking of them as how are they actually a liability in some cases. So retaining them for a significant amount of time does have a risk. I would say that I would absolutely recommend people read this book. I couldn't put it down. And I wrote so many pages of notes. Like I'm used to saying I wrote a lot of notes from these books.
Show us your notes.
I do it by hand, and it's chicken scratch. It's chicken scratch. But I wrote as many pages of notes as I did for some of the more technical ones, just because there's so many ideas I wanted to capture out of it. I would say that I would actually recommend 2 companion books to this, because he does talk about government surveillance. He does mention General Hayden and the NSA, and Hayden's book, Playing to the Edge, actually gets a name check in here. And I would recommend that if you want sort of the counter story as to why a government would retain data and do the things that it does, Hayden's book is great. If you want more of an approach, because he's sort of focuses on what he knows about the United States. If you want to know more about government surveillance outside the United States, Consent of the Networks by Rebecca McKinnon, which I'm reading right now, covers a lot of those. So China, Russia, Iran. So I don't know. I think I've started something here with my brain, and I'm reading more and more about these topics. I'm excited.
All right, very good. I think that's a very good endorsement. And data is a liability. I think that's a very important thing. I tend to think of data as kind of the opposite, or kind of a relation to sort of security policy. The tendency is to start a system, start a project, start an activity with a really simple, basic, and strong security policy, and then in time, all kinds of exceptions get made. And then you end up with this bloated set of rules that you really don't understand whether the system is secure anymore. And it's kind of the same kind of thing with data. That is, you start out with a clear objective, and the tendency is to, well, let's add this, add that, and not necessarily even considering, particularly since storage is relatively cheap. It's easy to kind of start accumulating things and become sort of a squirreling away a lot of things that aren't necessarily needed. So it's important to kind of go back, review what you're doing, making sure there's a policy around that, and that the data that you don't need is expiring.
Sure, and that you don't have feature creep as well, or mission creep is probably more accurate, saying I've got this set of data, I collected it for mission A, someone comes along and taps you on the shoulder and says, hey, we've got mission B, we'd love to have that data, and you lose some control over it, and some of the original good intentions behind why you collected it in the first place may get lost when it goes to mission B.
Yep, a lot of activities around that we're performing to make sure that the data doesn't become a problem, or that it is a beneficiary to the organization. So, good comments there, Matt. Thank you. That's I actually didn't realize that Bruce had a new book out, and now that I know, we're going to be on to get that book. So, the next topic here is actually there's lots of ISACs. That is what is it? Information security. I don't even know what
I don't know what the AC stands for, but it's a good point.
Shame on me for not knowing, but basically it's organizations for sharing information about particular topics to be able to help mutually benefit from protecting.
And it's usually
their
centered around
activities.
different industries, like the financial
Centered around
services
industries.
have one, telecom
there's
has
multi-state. There's the auto one here. There's a retail one for predominantly, I think, focused on point-of-sale transaction type activities. A number of others. Nevertheless, the focus here is on the auto industry. As automobiles become more connected and have more automation functions, they created an ISAC to be able to share information about this. And they published it a best practices document, and I decided, this sparked my interest. I took a review of it. It's not very big at this point. It's basically an 8-page document, or at least that was what I had access to. And but it's understandable. This is a new organization. They have some, and it's understandable they would start with the basics. So I just thought I'd share a few things that I hope it will evolve into. And by the way, we're a member of this organization. AT&T is facilitating making cars connected. And so this is some input I've already provided to our organization, and I'll share with you here. First of all, I hope it'll become, over time, a little more prescriptive. That is, I think that a best practices document, it's not a requirement, but to be able to say more specifically how to design systems, how to implement those systems, and perhaps define some standards or cite some standards that already exist about how to do that in an appropriate way, and possibly be able to use that as a standard so that as manufacturers are selling cars, they can cite those standards and say, we've met these criteria. It would be valuable to be able to have some standards to reference, to be able to say that, that's a selling point for manufacturers. Next item would be to have an architecture reference. That is, I think it's if you're going to talk about implementation, to have some references for architecture. And, there are some reference architectures and actually products and tools and protocols built around, controller area network for cars and automation in cars. And so it makes sense, I say cars, but in auto industry in general. And so to take that architecture and overlay security recommendations for that would make a lot of sense. So I think having a security reference architecture to overlay and then hopefully influence the products and protocols that are used in those systems. And then last but not least here, I think some topics like separation of control functions from perhaps other entertainment functions. I think that was one of the things that in the Charlie Miller demonstration, they showed that they went through the entertainment system into the control systems as a means to do their demonstration. Authentication of messages, how do you do authentication and how to manage that, verify the integrity of those, and so they cannot be perhaps forged from remote sources, which I think is another thing that facilitated that attack, and then or that demonstration of attack. And then last but not least here, software update requirements. Verification of software, being able to perform over the air updates in critical cases, or at the very least have user applied updates, not necessarily to have to go into a dealership, make appointments, and have a lot of rigmarole around that. So anyway, there's my thoughts. If you have any thoughts, please share them with us. Any comments from you gentlemen here?
Somebody needs to make a home automation and entertainment ISAC that covers like all these webcams, security camera DVRs, and televisions, and all these things people are sticking in their homes that are vulnerable.
That's perhaps actually a very good recommendation.
I don't know if that's the right name for it, but something of that nature. Anyway.
That actually highlights just how impressive it is that the auto industry is really taking the bull by the horns here in this topic. I got to attend CES this year, and in the connected car environments, I was shocked at how many companies were there demoing connected car security capabilities, and in particular providing consulting services to the automotive industry as they're developing these capabilities. General Motors, I think it was in January this year, they announced a bug bounty for their automobiles. So it's interesting to compare and contrast where the auto industry is and how seriously they're taking this to some other obvious areas where people should have learned these lessons long ago and clearly are demonstrating that they just either don't care or are not there on point yet.
Well, I think you had a really good idea. I think maybe it's time to come up with a playbook and say, you are now connecting the following high-value type of device to the internet. Say, I don't know, refrigerators. Maybe it's step by step. Now that you've gone for this long, now it's time to put up your ISAC. Now it's time to build these sorts of controls. Now it's time to put in this legislation. Maybe once we see this a couple more times, we'll figure out that once you start thinking about actually designing the product, you have to also think about all of the security framework to be built around it.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think in some respects we perhaps don't anticipate what the next steps really need to be.
Sure.
I think you're suggesting that history kind of repeats itself, and so we can learn from the history of other
That's kind of what I'm saying. I mean, after seeing the same sorts of things play out in IoT, going to home automation or going to connected car, I feel like we might, if we've learned the lessons, we know the building blocks, I think.
That's a good point. Yeah, I guess the one thing, and I'll just play counterpoint for a moment, that in the ISACs in general, is that the sharing process in itself is relatively labor intensive. And because we really haven't automated the notion around sharing like insights.
I see.
So
Yeah, 'cause
that's
sharing-
a big that's a big challenge in all of this. That is, it can't be the whole threat sharing industry can't be around sharing bad IP addresses because it's an intractable thing. It's something that can be worked around too easily. And so the insights thing. So it's a very labor intensive process. I think part of what makes it more complicated is I don't think there are that many differences between, say, the auto industry in terms of connecting things versus, just any other type of IoT thing and connecting things. There certainly are things that, and that was really where I tried to base my recommendations here. There are certain things about security for connected cars that you want to do as a part of an architectural design thing, but the threats aren't really fundamentally different. So I think that's one of the challenges that we have is that as more ISACs develop, it's great to have the interest group, but making sure that the information that's pertinent in one group gets to other groups effectively is one of the big challenges. All right, Matt, let's go to you. And this is an interesting vulnerability. So tell us a little more about it.
Sure. So this is actually a vulnerability in World of Warcraft. And I know some people will smile and say, oh, it's another video game thing. But I maintain that any system at all that has some sort of monetary value put into it by its users is a valid target. And World of Warcraft has made tons of money for Blizzard. And I really think that the value of an individual account on that system is worth something to be protected and probably worth for the attackers to attack.
Yeah, and absolutely. And folks that are enthusiastic about it certainly see value in it. And so that's an important aspect of this as well.
Sure. Yeah. So the attack that got laid out, I believe it was G-Data Software posted about this one. They found in the wild someone was trying to convince users to type a certain message into chat. Now this message is actually a Lua command, and anybody who's played around with Warcraft and modding knows that Lua is the language they use to draw out the GUI. So it's very extensible. It's kind of cool. You can see that people have made add-ons over the years for the game because this support is there. So what this actually allows you to do is hook a function, remove extra spaces, which does what you'd expect to do. You give it a string, it has extra spaces, it cuts them out and passes it on to the next thing. But they hook it and replace it with run script, which also does what you think it does, takes the input and runs it as a script. It's kind of like an exec call in other languages. And since remove extra spaces is run on all incoming chat commands, what this basically allows you to do is call run script on the contents of a message that somebody else controls. So this guy says, please run this command, it redefines that function, and the next thing he sends you is the exploit. And what that does is that actually backdoors a GUI element within the game and then resets the what you just did to the output so you know to suspect what's happening. After that, he gets his character within range of yours to trade, but since he controls your GUI, he runs something that automatically dumps all your golden items into his inventory and walks away. So he's basically just robbed you from your own GUI, and since the command came from your machine, it's valid. The system doesn't think anybody's cheating because, hey, you told them give them all the golden items.
Right.
And since players have had, they'll pay real world money for items, they'll spend hours and hours grinding in the game to get these things. You really are robbing this person. It's not just a digital
cyber-mugging.
Yeah, it's
kind of.
No. This is cyber hypnosis. You will give me your money now.
Well, I mean, it's interesting because it still requires the user to type something stupid into their browser, into their chat for no good reason. Blizzard has put in a little warning because I think they want to keep it extensible, but they want people to know when this change is being made. It's like, hey, are you sure you want to make this change to your Lua environment?
Right.
And you have to say yes and understand it. But I think we were talking before about there's been things like this where you trick someone into typing some code into their browser, or it's the same sort of social engineering. I don't know how you'd tell someone, type in this random string and they would go ahead and do it. But then again, I guess I've been in computer security too long.
What you tell them before that is this will give you 100,000 gold or something.
That's true.
If you type this special, and probably somebody who doesn't really know what they're doing types it in, and then all of a sudden all their money's gone.
They might fall for that.
Yeah.
Hopefully not more than once.
Right, yes.
So this is, I guess, another example of a case where we're blurring the distinction between data and code, right?
Yeah, that's true.
And it reminds me of the von Neumann computer architecture from way back when. I think this dates back to the 50s, by the way, so it's even before my time, but where the architecture was actually deliberately hardware program space was separated from data space. I think there was actually purpose in that at the time. That is, if you remember, well, you may have seen pictures of back when where the program was actually on cards.
Is this when you had to take the vacuum tubes and like use those
Yeah,
too?
you had to actually wiggle them and make sure that they were working.
Get the bugs out?
Get the bugs out. Yes. Well, those were the relays, yes. But the program was on cards. It would load into the system, and then you'd actually execute, sort of out of data memory. But ultimately, what it came down to is that there was a clear separation between the two, and then in time, basically, that blurred. We, combine the memory, programs can run into, and that's where we get into data, and that's where our data can run into programs.
Right.
That's where we get the buffer overflows and situations where you can't really tell if it's data or a program, and so it can execute what was data. So this is one of the challenges we have with this sort of thing. We were talking. Michael Singer, one of our colleagues, he's going to come on. We're going to talk a little bit about the notion of hopefully being able to try to reverse that trend. That is, we tend to be victims of data that gets treated as code. Perhaps we can use code in data to help protect that data. So it's
Do you mean embed special code in data that sort of patches the problem when it gets...
something along those lines.
I want to see how this
to make the data a little bit smarter about itself and to perhaps help
Smart
protect
data.
itself. Yeah, smart data. So
Trademark that.
AT&T
There's
smart data.
another angle to this, and I just feel like if people are parents, if you've got kids that are online gamers between like 10 and 14, this type of vulnerability, this kind of attack is actually really, really common. And most kids are super vulnerable to being told, hey, if you just type in this one secret command, it allows you to hack your account and do all these really cool things. And then they inevitably get hurt. So I think a thing that maybe members of our audience should consider is if you do have kids that are into the online gaming community, this WoW exploit, this is actually pretty common. There's been all sorts of Steam exploits and things affecting even Xbox Live games and PlayStation Network games. So maybe a thing to take away here is that guidance you should give your children is strangers on the internet are always bad, and many times they will tell you secret key commands that you can enter in so you can do special things. But most of the time they're going to do something that you're not going to like. So don't listen to strangers on the internet when they tell you to type in exotic-looking commands in a command prompt.
it doesn't even have to be exotic, but I think your point is well made. Very good, Patrick. Thank you. Okay, and with that, I think we'll go to some more traditional flaws.
Yeah.
I'm looking at you, but I'm not referring to you.
Oh,
Joe.
well, I am very flawed, so I don't take it personally. So Oracle released their latest patch set here, and one of the things in this release, there are a bunch of vulnerabilities, I think some 270 or something, but there are 6 or so, I think, that were remote code execution. Some of those are in what's called Oracle's Outside in Technology Software Developers Kit, which is a set of libraries for working with various document formats or other file formats in general.
Do you have to be outside when you use it? Because I know a lot of programmers who it wouldn't work for. Okay.
That's true. Most of them are in a cave somewhere, coding away, like myself. In any event, that's also, that toolkit or those SDKs are part of the Oracle Fusion middleware, which is licensed to other developers to use in their products. So if they need to work with these file formats, it's this set of libraries to do that. It's convenient. So a lot of third-party software development companies have used these libraries, this Oracle Fusion middleware, in their products. So that's where the problem is. So now you've got this middleware that's in a lot of other companies' products, and there's some interesting ones like Microsoft Exchange. It's in Novell GroupWise, IBM WebSphere, which is a servlet container, Google Search Appliance, Avira Antivirus for Exchange, which is the antivirus that runs on the Exchange server, and even Guidance Encase, which is a forensic tool. So if you use forensic tools, now I'm forensicing a machine, I might be trying to use their preview mode for their document thing that they have here, and now able to get compromised just from that. So that's a kind of scary. They threw a couple of scary ones in there in the example. One of the things they do mention is on Microsoft Exchange servers, if you're familiar with the web-ready document viewing, which is that preview mode when you're viewing an email in Outlook. And you can click a tab. If you had an attachment of a PDF or something, it'll kind of show you. That's using this library. So if somebody sent you a malicious attachment that tried to exploit that, potentially you could have that happen. They mentioned a few other things. Cisco Talos did the research on this. They actually have a really good blog post about how you could exploit it. The one I thought was really interesting is that if you have a Microsoft Exchange server that does have the Avira antivirus for Exchange installed, just sending an email through with an attachment that's weaponized, the email server, the antivirus software, is going to look at this and say, well, does this look like it's malware? And it's going to detonate the exploit and trigger that vulnerability in that software development kit and get the server infected, which is not necessarily a good thing.
And this is theoretical. It's
theoretical. I don't know that they've actually seen this exploited in the wild, but Cisco Talos Group had done probably some proof of concept to make sure that this would actually function this way as part of their reporting. So I guess one of the things I was thinking about with this, and a lot of us struggle with this, is when you're doing software development, you have middleware, do you have good processes in your environment to know, especially when you're a big company, you might develop a lot of different things. Do you know where various middleware and other third-party libraries that you're importing are being used, such that when things like this come to light, you can understand, where in your software development or in your enterprise you're impacted. I don't know, I just thought it was
I think this
worth
is
mentioning.
The whole notion around code reuse has been a very positive thing, but from a security standpoint, it's a challenge, and that you really have to have an understanding of where that code reuse is taking place. I think the notion around having a software build of materials so that you have some of an inventory of what's in the different applications, and perhaps if you're trying to manage the vulnerability patching and the tracking and the auditing centrally, you'd have a central database that manages those, and would need to be updated pretty regularly to be able to support it. So it's a relatively,
and everybody needs to, all the development teams need to adhere to that policy, even if it's a small little thing, that might not necessarily be widely distributed.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's part of the new challenge in the world as more things transition from an appliance-based world that's vendor supported into a virtualized world. These are things that need to be accommodated or taken into account to make sure that the virtualized world is at least as secure as the traditional appliance-based world.
Right, right.
All right.
And then the thing about these middleware things is, now that Oracle has released it, your vendors for all these other products that might use it, you might not even know if those are being implemented in various products. You have to wait for them to kind of tell you, hey, we have a patch for this, and it's because of this, other middleware component we were using as part of our product that we're delivering to you. So,
I guess one aspect of this, I'm perhaps a little slow to learn, but I still have this stereotype in my mind. When I hear the word Oracle, I think of database management system.
Yeah.
And but I think Oracle has diversified significantly, and I think a big part of that diversification, and perhaps related to this, was when they acquired Sun Microsystems. And Sun Microsystems was in the process of transitioning into basically a software company at the time, and so there are a lot of tools like this that were drawn in as a part of that acquisition. I don't think they're in the server business anymore at all, or certainly not as much. I guess they perhaps are still selling, but it's all x86
I don't really know,
stuff.
to be honest with you. But they've got their hands in a lot of pots, though, because they've got database, they've got operating. Well, I don't know if it's really. They've got languages like Java. They've got even isn't VirtualBox? Isn't the virtualization, or is that? I think that's
VirtualBox, and not only that, there's actually they acquired a company called Tekelec a couple of years ago, which is a mobility infrastructure provider.
Yep.
So, it's really good to underline the point here, Brian. Oracle is involved in a lot.
Yep, absolutely. So, It's important to keep an open mind when you hear the word Oracle and consider all of the very aspects of what they may be influencing in your IT environment. So, thank you for that, John.
Yeah.
And on a lighter note, perhaps, Matt, maybe you can share with us. I took a look at the Mr. Robot episode, I think just last night, and I have to admit, I don't pick up on all the subtleties that you pick up on. So, I guess first, a spoiler alert for those that
Absolutely.
haven't seen it.
Spoiler alert, cover your ears, because I'm going to be mentioning some things.
Can I disconnect here?
Yes, you can.
You might want to. You absolutely might want to.
or mute your ears.
All right, so here we go. You've been warned. So we're going to talk about the latest episode of Mr. Robot, and it's the tech that gets mentioned in it. There's a scene at Romero's house, who's one of the members of F Society. You show up and you can clearly see Kali Linux on his screen, which I think has happened before in the show, but worth mentioning because, yes, this is probably the gold standard for penetration testing distributions. So thumbs up for them for bringing that into the show. There is a point at which an agent of the law plugs a device in to try and perform forensics, and the machine catches fire. I assume this is a thermite explosion. I've seen work online to try and design something that does something like this. In particular, there was an episode of the show called The Broken, which was probably ways back now, where they built a thermite bomb for a laptop to self-destruct it. So it's completely feasible to do this. You take a little bit of tinkering inside and find a way to trigger that explosion, but there's definitely enough electrical power inside of a computer to trigger some sort of detonator to kick off a thermite explosion, which would totally melt the whole thing. There's a scene where they're talking about a website, and Bitcoin hot and cold wallets are mentioned. And I was impressed by this, because this is pretty cool. The concept of hot and cold wallets, for those who don't know, hot wallets are the ones that are stored in some sort of online exchange and are accessible very easily. Cold wallets are when you have the wallet information stored offline. It's not part of some sort of exchange system. And hot wallets are obviously more convenient. Cold wallets are more secure. So having that discussion and saying the guy was basically complaining he didn't know enough about it to do what he needed to do that was being asked of him. And Bitcoin is a little confusing, and we talked about it when I did my book review a while back, so I was impressed by that little reference as well.
I thought it was a little interesting too. I'm not quite sure if I'm interpreting it right, but it seems like there might be a little organized crime around this Bitcoin.
That's
stuff.
my take on it as well.
I can't think of his name now. The character but in any event, it was interesting that he's kind of like the muscle, like trying to hey, turn over the Bitcoin keys for.
Well, that's the thing about that character, and I regret that I can't remember his name, is that he seems like such a very reasonable human being, and he's sort of like the benevolent boss, but you realize during that scene that there's a lot more going on, because the way they shoot that one shot, and you see the first half of the guy's face, and you see the second half, and it's like, all right, now I know what this is about. There's a couple Alexa mentions in there. There's a good joke. Alexa, when is the end of the world coming? And it has an answer. I like that a lot. One of the more interesting parts of the show was the fact that Elliot's mind is deteriorating, and his mental illness is shown as computer glitches. Either there's some definite kernel panic screens that are legitimately ones. There's like an SE Linux crash at some point that they flash up on the screen because he's starting to lose it. Another one that I liked a lot was he's watching the basketball game and it starts to repeat itself and then sort of degrade the quality. It's like you're watching a YouTube video as you lose your connection to the internet, and it starting to downgrade your quality of the video over and over. So that was a neat one as well.
And it goes a little further than that. He was, as he was talking to himself, he's talking about how he's trying to get his mental state back into, at least under control. He's always talking about trying to get control, and he's saying, I need to. And he's talking about using regular debugging techniques. I need to put an interrupt in here.
He did say I set a breakpoint and try the next thing.
He's applying computer, he's basically turning himself into a computer, or making that as an analogy. To which when he mentioned a kernel panic, anybody who uses computers, if I had a kernel panic in my brain, I was like, oh God, that's really bad. And my wife was like, what does that mean? I don't understand. I said,
it takes
that's the worst thing that can happen in your brain. Anyway, I thought it was a good analogy for his condition.
And the one last thing I did want to mention is I'm a bit of a movie music buff, and they did use a music cue from Philip Glass, which I recognized immediately because I'd seen it not in the original film, but in The Truman Show, where it gets used. It's called Mishima, I think, is the movie it's from. But for me, that always sort of does it. I know that the creators of the show are paying attention. They're referencing back to other things. It's kind of cool.
All right. Well, thanks for that, Matt. And I got a little more out of the show because of you, so I appreciate it. All right, let's take a look at the internet weather for the last week or so here. And first of all, we're looking at the top 10 most probed ports. This is actually from July 25th, and oh my gosh. Yeah. What we have is port 53413 actually, I think, winning the prize in the top here. It's moved up 18 spots, actually taking over the slot that port 23 had been holding for quite some time here. So we're going to obviously take a little closer look at that as we go forward. Not a whole lot of movement here. We saw port 25 move up a little bit in terms of ranking 5 slots, but I think we had covered actually scanning activity on the email ports as basically research organization activity, less of a concern from a security standpoint, although you want to be cognizant of that if you see that probing activity on your network. But nevertheless, that port 25 activity is consistent with that. Followed by port 22 TCP, 53 UDP, 80 TCP, and then we see 3389 showing up on here, and we're going to take a little closer look at that a little bit later on here. Port 143, that's associated with email activity, and then 1911 TCP. I always forget this one, but it's at Industrial Control Protocol. It seems to be pretty consistently on there. It's
Tritium,
also
Niagara, Fox,
right.
Something like that. Yeah.
Yes, and that's, again, associated research activity. And then we're seeing port 21 FTP showing on the list here. Looking at the top 10 most sources doing the probing, we have port 23 still holding its spot at the top of the list here. In this case, more than 690,000 unique sources. That's actually down. We saw a peak of around, I think, 840,000. Maybe even, perhaps even a little bit higher than that. And then followed by 53413. This is on the order of about 260,000 sources. And that's kind of curious because on an hourly basis, we're only seeing on the order of about 20,000 or so, 20 to 30,000 sources. So that shows that there's a significant rotation throughout the course of the day. This is actually a collimation of 24 hours.
They could just be spoofing the source.
Well, actually,
you don't need it.
That's a very good point,
response
John, that in this particular scenario, if the activity is coming from a network that does not enforce ingress filtering, it could be spoofed source addresses.
I'm not saying it is, but it could be.
Yeah, absolutely true. And so one of the things that kind of comes about, we'll look at it a little bit more closely as we look at the port 53 stuff a little bit later on here. No others that are really shown significant. Port 445 is next on the list, way down comparatively, and we see port 22 on the list as well, and some of this other P2P stuff. So looking at the port 53413 UDP, and just as a reminder, this is associated with the Netis home routers. There's a whole line of these devices that are available. You can buy them on Amazon. I guess I'm not really recommending it at the moment because I don't know which devices actually have the backdoor and which ones don't have that backdoor, but there certainly are a number of them out there. It's much more popular to see these in Asia than in the United States. But nevertheless, this is looking at the last year of activity. As you can see, the activity well to the right, just the last few days, several days, it's actually quite through the roof. That is, on a given hour, we're seeing on the order of, counting in the billions of probes per hour. If you look at that, and this is looking at IPv4 address space predominantly, by the way. And so if we consider how many probes it takes to get across the entire address space, there are theoretically enough probes there to cover the entire address space in the course of an hour. That is, we're not looking at the entire network here. We're just looking at a small portion of it, relatively speaking, to the entire address space. But as you can see on the bottom, the number of sources is not as significant. Now, to John's point, some of this activity could be spoofed. So you may have a number of contributors using the same source address. So that would help to explain the difference between the number of sources and the number of probes that are taking place there. But I guess my theory here is that it's actually, compared to probing on a TCP port, this is a case where they're just tossing a packet out. And so it's significantly less expensive processing-wise to just toss a packet out and forget about it. and maybe the system responds to it, than if you were to try to actually establish a TCP session and do password guessing and activities around that. So I suspect that's the reason why it appears that the performance activity in this case is much higher relative to the the port 23 activity, which is the next graph here. Showing at the bottom, consistent with the last, we're seeing the number of sources that are scanning. On the top, the number of probes. And this is relatively stable or consistent from what we've seen over the last few weeks. Down slightly, but not a significant change in activity. So that activity is continuing to go on. Again, this is generally probing activity, doing password guessing attacks against, for the most part, these closed circuit TV DVRs. And then bringing back an old friend here, this is actually a backdoor port. This is 32.764 TCP, and this is associated with home routers. This was actually, I think, documented around 2014 or so, and it was taken out, and then there were actually some articles that claimed that it had been reintroduced, that is, this backdoor reintroduced to some devices. It was associated with Linksys devices, some Linksys devices, some Netgear devices, some Cisco devices, and maybe a lot of them have been patched and have been removed, but there still is some probing activity around this over the last 30 days. And I just thought it would be helpful to take a look at the geographic distribution of these devices, and where we're seeing most of them is actually in South Korea, in China. We see some in Vietnam. We also see some in Europe, and relatively few, comparatively speaking, in the United States. So that's perhaps good news if you're in the United States, but perhaps not so good news if you're living in China. So, and then the last but not least here, looking at the scam probes on, more generally speaking, remote desktop ports. So we have 3389, that's remote desktop protocol, and then 5900, which is virtual network computing, I think it is, or that's correct. And then 5901 is actually an alternate port. That is, if 5900 is already occupied, it will sequence to the next port. And what we're seeing here is actually, generally speaking, I think an increase in what we're seeing in terms of probing on remote desktop protocol that seems to have become more popular. We're looking at 2 years of activity here, so over the last, say, few months, an increase in that probing activity. And then, but if we look at, in general, I think looking mostly in terms of the number of sources doing that scanning, you saw that there were, you can see over to the left, there's more red there. That's associated with the port 5900, and that has been diminishing, relatively speaking, to the remote desktop protocol sources that are probing for that. Now, we've seen in the past where, even point of sale system registers have had remote desktop protocol enabled and accessible from the internet. That would be a big no-no if you're in the retail ISAC to be describing that kind of scenario. But it's one of these cases that where folks need to be paying attention to what devices are actually exposed to the internet and how that could potentially be abused. So, especially
like when you talked about the point of sale in small
businesses,
like businesses, like restaurants and other things where they might have that point of sale being managed by some other third party for them. Remote desktop tends to be open, and they should have better controls around that.
Yep, absolutely. So pay attention to who you're outsourcing to.
Yeah.
Next item, or last, is the daily reconnaissance index. We haven't looked at this in a while. So this is kind of like, looking at the Dow Jones Industrial Average or the NASDAQ, but the trending we desire to see is the opposite. We would like the reconnaissance index to go down, but because of the contributions of the number of sources increasing significantly, predominantly on Telnet, as well as the number of probes increasing significantly in Telnet, as well as on that port 53413, you can see that our reconnaissance index has gone up significantly, and we're looking at about a year's worth of data here. There are a couple of gaps in there. Occasionally our report doesn't generate exactly correctly, so that explains the gaps. But as you can see, our reconnaissance index is up over 100. We've been tracking this index since back in the Sasser worm days, and this is the first time that it's exceeded 100 since that time. I think we calibrated it around 90 at that time. So it gives a little bit of reference point. So Lots more sources scanning, lots more probes taking place, and none of them with the intent of doing good. So that's our show for today. We'd like to thank you for joining us. And if you'd like to get in touch with us, you can email us at attthreattrack@list.att.com. There's also a link off the Tech Channel page so that you can contact us from there. You can find AT&T Threat Track on the AT&T Tech Channel. It's on YouTube, and it's available as an audio podcast on iTunes. And you can follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @ATTBusiness. And final plug for you, Patrick here. Visit Roots, that's r00tz.org for info on the Roots Asylum, and get your kids involved in that event. And I'd like to thank you, Patrick, for joining us today. Thank you, John Hogeboom. Thank you, Matt Kaiser.
Sure.
I especially liked the book review. It was my favorite today.
You're very welcome.
I'm Brian Rexroad. We'll be back next week with a new episode, and until then, keep your network safe.